And I remember it was the 27th of June.
That we were all leaving England to come to Canada and that we were going to be placed in different homes.
So I said, where's Canada? I don't know what she said, but we're going to
So many people said it was a wonderful country to come to. I didn't seem to mind the hard work at all.
The worst part was the homesickness. Cries out to sleep.
It was the way she was so nasty to me.
Said, oh, them English girls, they need a beating every day.
You know, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child.
I have difficulty showing love with my children.
I think there are some people who really don't feel they know who they are unless they know who mother was and who father was. And it is particularly there in those families where the past is somewhat of a mystery.
That was when I was in the Middlemore Homes. And that was 2 or 3 days before we left for Canada. I think I'm right in the middle there. Yeah.
Right there, yeah.
Like more than 100,000 other British children, Annie Faraday left everything and everyone she knew behind her, and as a child began a new life in a new country.
My mother and father separated. And you see, my mother was going into domestic service. And so they had to do something about me, you see.
With the onslaught of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, hundreds of thousands of rural people were forced off the land and descended upon the cities to work in factories. Appalling conditions existed in places like the Birmingham slums. Cheap houses built for migrants were crowded and poorly maintained, and as many as 15 families shared a toilet. Yards were filthy and swarming with children. Entire families were forced to work in order to provide the bare essentials. Mothers often went into domestic service, caring for the homes and families of the middle class and paying out a substantial portion of their income for childcare. Government favored the interests of wealthy industrialists and provided little meaningful intervention. Homeless children scavenged for survival, begging for food and sleeping in the dark alleys of the world's wealthiest nation. Author and journalist Kenneth Bagnall explains.
Britain had a big problem in its major cities, too many children who were destitute. And some evangelical Christians came to the conclusion that the answer was to take them from the streets into institutions in those cities. The children, most of the time, were either found on the street or sometimes delivered by the parents to the institution where they would be taken care of.
Some of the more well-known of the organizations included Bernardo Homes, Church of England Waifs and Strays Society, Fegan Homes, Quarrier Homes, and Middlemore Homes. Eventually, the actual running of these homes and charities became a means of livelihood for thousands of Victorians.
Mother died, father went somewhere. Her aunts and uncles rounded us up and took us to the Middlemore home in Birmingham, England.
I was very happy in the Middlemore home. We all had a floor to scrub every night before we had our supper.
They never punished her or nothing there, you know, unless you didn't do anything too bad. But then you had the run of the orphanage. But I took my place up to the babies. I like babies there.
Of the more than 50 child-saving organizations in Great Britain, Bernardo Homes was one of the most successful. Their motto, "No destitute child ever refused." But an open door at the front requires an exit door at the back, and this was Bernardo's justification for the program he named Highway of Hope. Beyond the back door lay Canada, with its fresh air and farm life. The distant Dominion would be good for the children, he said. Canada was in great need of immigrants, not to mention cheap labor, and even small children were welcome help on a farm.
Canada needed workers. Britain needed to reduce the population of children. And so these historic movements and conditions fitted each other like a hand fits a glove.
Well, I had read that book, Anne of Green Gables, and I thought, oh, I think I'd like that, to go out to Canada.
With more than 30% of the British population living in abject poverty, the government and a group of religious do-gooders devised a plan to immigrate children to other parts of the empire.
Well, there were 2 or 3 evangelical Christians who came up with it. Maria Rye in the 1860s was the first. She was followed by the McPherson sisters, 3 women who brought children mainly from Liverpool. And then the prime mover in child immigration, Thomas John Bernardo, who aspired to be a medical doctor but was persuaded that this was a Christian mission that he was called to.
Bernardo was an Irishman who in his early 20s established the East End Juvenile Mission in London and soon attracted thousands of destitute children. Bernardo went on to become the greatest child emancipator in history, and between 1868 and 1939, his organization was responsible for the immigration of more than 30,000 children to Canada.
There were so many in the slums of England, and somebody got the right idea they could do better over here. And in some cases they did, but there was an awful lot of disappointments.
Gwendolyn Rose Bennett was 6 years old when she was placed in the Middlemore home in Birmingham, England. Her mother was having financial problems, and she and her siblings were placed in the home as a temporary measure. At age 8, she was put on a ship and sent to Canada. She never saw her family again.
And of course, at the time that I went in there, they were preparing a bunch of the children to come over here. And I was added in that group, which I would like to have kicked them in the...
The British child savers portrayed Canada as a vast garden of plenitude. They believed the clean air and hard work would allow the children to thrive. Here, opportunities existed for the paupers to gain an education and find a place in a society supposedly free from class consciousness.
We thought it was going to be wonderful, of course, coming to Canada, because we had heard so many stories about it, you know.
Oh, they had great stories of Canada. You know, yeah, you could pick gold off the streets.
The line that Dad used to say they used on the boys about the log cabins and the Indians and the Mounties and all this kind of stuff that would be appealing to boys. His memory of going down to Liverpool and getting on the boat, and he was fascinated by the steamship. Dad thought it was quite an adventure.
Unfortunately, Fred Reynolds' sense of adventure wasn't shared by all. Sometimes children were sent to Canada without the knowledge or permission of their parents, a move that was eventually made legal by the British Parliament. In these cases, notices were forwarded to parents after the child had landed in the new country.
She told me that she had what she called a carpet bag, a rag doll, a Bible, and a copy of Pilgrim's Progress that was given to her by her Sunday school teacher.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms hath bound the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea. They sang that at the wharf. There was 100 of us, boys and girls.
And I remember it was the 27th of June. We left from Liverpool. Yeah, we left from Liverpool.
But we enjoyed 3 or 4 days on the boat, running around there, up and down all over the place there. The sea was rough at times there. Everybody got sick on the road.
We came over on the Samaria. I think it's a White Star liner. I got an awful weak stomach. And the first couple of 3 days I wasn't very sociable.
The matron, our matron, was a wonderful woman. And she said, well, dear, she said, the Lord had this planned for you before you were even born. And I said, well, I wish he had planned something else.
Be strong and have a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. And how many times I used to sit and read that. How many times? That was all I had to go by. I didn't have any friends or anyone to tell my troubles to.
Susan Kelly was born in Limehouse, England in 1909. As an infant, she was placed in a home on the outskirts of London. In June of 1920, at the age of 10, she set sail for Canada, where she was eventually adopted by a family in Ontario.
So finally then we landed in Quebec. The nun was there. She brought us all an ice cream cone. I never tasted ice cream in my life there, you know. So she brought us all an ice cream cone. That was a good treat there, you know.
When the children arrived in Canada, they usually landed in Quebec City or Pier 1 in Halifax and were sent by train to the receiving home of the organization which sent them. Receiving homes were concentrated mostly in Ontario, but also existed in Manitoba, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Here, the children were prepared for placement on Canadian farms. Children destined for farms in maritime Canada were often taken to Middlemore's Fairview home in Halifax.
They were immediately put to work. I've heard stories of children going out and gathering stones in buckets, clearing fields and planting crops, topping turnips, pulling carrots, that type of thing. They earned their living.
When a new shipment of home children arrived in Canada, an ad would be placed in newspapers inviting those who would like to claim one to come to see them. A farmer would make an application for a child of a particular age and gender. The agreement required the child to remain with the farmer until they turned 18. In turn, they were to receive room and board and a small payment released only when the indentured labor ended.
Mrs. Ragg, the lady that took us, she was the matron of the home there in Fairview. She took another girl and myself, and she told the two of us, one of you are going to Petticoat and the other one is going to Sussex. And I thought to myself, oh, I hope I go to Sussex. I hope I don't go to that queer-sounding name that she said. I couldn't even repeat it, you know, it sounded so funny. But I was the one that got put off the train at Petticoat, my first place to work. Well, I stood there on the station platform, and there was nobody there to meet me. Nobody there to meet me.
I was so disappointed, I wanted to go right back. I asked, was there any children in the house? No, there was just this old crippled lady and the two men. Well, I lay down on the couch and I cried myself to sleep, finally. I didn't want to stay, I wanted to go back. I wanted to go home with my mother and my brothers.
It was 9 miles of the back roads of Petticoat, and I kept thinking, I hope it's a nice white house. I hope it's one of those nice white houses that I say. But when we got there, it was an old grey house, and I don't think it had ever had any paper on it.
At that time, the physical needs were the important needs. The need for shelter, for food, for work, and the clean, bracing air of Canada.
Most child migrants arrived in Canada with a preconceived notion of their new home as a pastoral paradise. They were soon confronted with a far different reality. They were often unprepared for the harshness of the Canadian climate. Farmers were often poor and overworked. They were no-nonsense people with little time for idleness. The children would be separated from friends and siblings and placed on remote farms miles from towns or villages and immediately put to work.
Dear Mr. Jackson, here I work hard from 5 o'clock in the morning until dark at night. I milk the cows and I can now rake and build a load of hay. I'm getting to be a regular farmer. R. Oakley.
There was children kind of handy that went to school with, but I could never go out with them to play. Or I was 10.5 years old when I learned how to take her up out of bed. She was a woman that weighed about 300 pounds dead weight. You know, she couldn't help herself. And then she'd come out and she'd say, "Hey, Gwenny, do you want to try to make some bread?" I'd say, "No." So the first time I ever made loaf bread, I had to have the pan on the chair. I couldn't knead it on the table.
They kept about 40 cows, and they had sheep and they had pigs. And of course it was all new to me. I'd never been on a farm in my life before.
My hands are never used to any farm work, and it had a tough time. Wasn't no giant of a man anyway, and I did what I could, you know. Had a hard job learning to milk the cows.
I worked inside as long as there was work to do inside. And when the inside work was done, if there was any outside work to be done, like thinning the turnips, pulling the bugs off the potatoes.
So every morning we had to get the fire going to throw the tea kettle out and throw the pump out so we get a little water out of the system. And my God, it was cold. Well, they put me out over the kitchen the first winter, and I did freeze to death. The worst part was the homesickness. Just couldn't get over it, you know. You'd go to bed nights and cry yourself to sleep. Just no way out, you know.
Oh, yeah, sometimes they were worked very, very hard, and many times they were denied their education. We all think that's terrible, that's child labor. And from our vantage point today, it is. But their understanding was that they were doing a favor to this child by taking this child in. In return, this child was not primarily a member of the family, not exclusively a worker, but somewhere in between.
I didn't seem to mind the hard work at all. It was the way that she was so nasty to me. She wasn't very nice to me at all.
My mother and her brother were abused quite badly. Punishment was sleeping in a chicken coop, being beat, with a gat or a cane. I had a cousin that told me, he said, "Do you know why your father married your mother?" He said, "Because the place she was staying was working her like a man. And your dad said that no woman should be treated that way. That's why he married her."
I guess if I were to select one that was really tragic, my mind goes back to a man named Charles Goddard, who ended up on a farm where the people prayed twice a day, and they beat him terribly. Beat him and beat him. And they placed him in the doghouse, like an outhouse, where the dog and he lived. He had enough to eat if the dog didn't eat all that was given him.
I've always thought it would be lovely for all us boys and girls to get together.
In 1987, Annie organized the first Middlemore reunion. This eventually led to a yearly event drawing together hundreds of Middlemore home children and their descendants. These reunions have resulted in a number of friendships that have endured the years.
Headed occupation, domestic, and you was only 6 years old.
I did housework from the time I was 6.
And that was your intended occupation, and only 6 years old.
Yep.
Yeah.
My name is Elsie Hathaway, and my brother got on a train to go to Cape Tormentine, where he was going to go work on a farm. And I went to Cape Breton Island to do housework. I was 6 years old. I never saw him again until I was 14.
And then you came to our reunion, and I said to you, I said, you got family there, we're your family.
Yes, we're family. They told us to be good and to work hard, because we were going to the land of milk and honey.
We're still looking for the milk and honey.
I know, we are, yeah.
I'm Sid Coles, and I come from Rugby, England. My father didn't want to keep me anywhere, so he put me in the home. Where I worked was used good, except that I ate in the kitchen and they ate in the dining room. But I was used good, and there was no trouble that way.
First thing you know, I go to turn it over, and it would break. It would be running all over. If you don't stop tearing those pancakes, she says, I'm going to put your hand on the griddle and burn it, she said.
And you know something, I remember my first Christmas. Kids there at the home place where I lived run down and say, come on, see what Santa Claus left you. And anyway, I was excited, and I went down, and I thought, well, I hope I got something in my sock. So when they got down there, they found their sock, and it was full of goodies, toys and candy and orange and apple. So when I got my sock, I hate to tell you this, but it had potato peelings and chicken legs in it.
Oh.
Yeah, that's my first Christmas in Canada.
Potato peelings and what else?
Chicken legs and potato peelings. And I was bawling, and they told me that I was a bad girl, and Santa Claus figured I didn't deserve anything.
Isn't that awful?
If you're told that, if you feel that, when you're 8 and 9 years old, for long enough, you'll feel it forever.
Living as a child that isn't loved and cared for is putting them under duress 24 hours a day. It's like they're in the war zone.
Oh, yeah.
So they have anxiety, they have attachment issues originally right back to their parent, to their mother, being abandoned. And then just crying when you realize that you are so needy. It's crying out of a neediness, a crying out of a desperation, wanting to know yourself more.
I never tell that to very many people, only just my children, and some of them don't know it.
And this is the case right across the country. The children, for 5 or 6 reasons, built a wall around themselves and didn't communicate even to family that they were home children, because the word home children was a very dirty word.
I was called everything but a white person in school, and why was I here, and cruel, just cruel to you.
There was always the stigma attached to home children. If she did something out of the way, the first remark was, well, what do you expect from a home child?
They were also called street Arabs. They were called offal of the empire, offal, fertilizer of the empire. And cartoons of the day show the do-gooders shoveling these little kids into the back of horse-drawn wagons. Now, if you're shoveling behind a horse, you're shoveling more than kids into that wagon.
If British child migrants felt unwanted in their homeland, they found their welcome in Canada decidedly mixed. Although the program was generally well supported, some Canadians considered these British paupers the dregs of society. They were thought to be less intelligent than Canadian children and totally without morals. According to an article entitled The Importation of Waifs, The Globe, Toronto, Ontario, October 9, 1884. Canada wants increased population, but she would not on that account thank any country for landing the inmates of its prisons and poorhouses on her shores. The criminal, the diseased, the pauperized, and the vicious are not wanted.
My mother there said somebody told her to, said, oh, them English girls, they need a beating every day. So she was beating me every day, so I used to tell her, Mama, I didn't do anything to get a beating. I said, why are you beating me? Oh, you're going to get a licking anyway. I don't know, somebody had told her that, It's crazy things, said about us.
There was no money, all the farmers in New Brunswick, they're all starting out there, and they were living the hard life too. But they shouldn't have took it out on the kids.
It's more work for parents, certainly, to always meeting the need of the child by listening, by being connected, by loving the child, than it is to just simply supply food, shelter, and safety. But a lot of these children weren't even given safety, because to be beaten every day is not very safe. It's abuse. It's just the way it is. However, that was, in those times, very much the way many children were raised. Not just the home children, but many families raised their children.
In the end, I think we can't understand child immigration unless we see it through the prism of economics. Even when an inspector came out in the early years, a man named Andrew Doyle, sent out by Britain to look into the conditions, and he criticized the supervision as being inadequate. When he reported back to Britain, nothing was done because the economic realities had been set in motion. And there were still people here who wanted these children for economic reasons, and there were still the forces at work in England that wanted to get rid of them.
The program changed and it became an industry. That means you have to find a supply. It's the law of supply and demand. And the demand in Canada was huge. I mean, there were about 10 applications for every child. What there was a shortage of was supply. So they used every tactic and every subterfuge they could, including kidnapping. I mean, I had one old gentleman that told me, my sister and I were asked, would we like to go on a camping holiday to Canada? He just recently was almost 90 years old, and he's still here. So that's the longest camping holiday, he told me, in existence.
I don't believe that Bernardo operated out of motives that were evil or dark or worthy of suspicion. But he didn't understand that children needed emotional care. He didn't see that uprooting children this way and sending them to a strange country across the ocean would have a terribly traumatic effect on them.
There was an awful lot of them that got abused awful bad, and a lot of the girls got raped. I got it all wrote down, so my family can read it after I'm gone.
It's still hard now to think that she was actually treated that unfairly. I would go back now and probably wring their necks for different things that they've done to my gram, because no one should be treated that way.
I think that it's the same for anyone who has endured great pain. You would never inflict it on someone else because you know how hard it is for you.
I think they, in every case, were not only protecting themselves, but were protecting their family. And I have the greatest respect for them. So they were silent heroes in many senses of the word.
Dear Sir, I now take pleasure in writing a few lines to let you know how much I like Canada. I like it very much and have been well ever since I came here. I would like to know if my little brother Freddie is still in the home, and please let me know if he is coming to Canada in the spring. Many thanks for the paper you sent me. W. Mann.
Well, I can tell the story. You just want to come up and sit up at the table and we'll look at some pictures? My name's Gord Reynolds. I'm the only son of Fred Reynolds, who was a home child that came over here in 1923. Dad was able to look after himself until he had a stroke when he was 88. Do you remember this picture? That's you when you were a little boy.
Was that?
Yeah, over in England. Don't you remember the big tricycle you coerced your mother into getting the picture taken?
No.
Well, I guess that's a long stretch. You were only 4 there.
In some cases, the children were lucky enough to find a truly loving home. Fred Reynolds was 14 years old when he was sent to a farm in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Fred became a cherished member of the MacDonald family.
Norman?
Norman. Stuart. Audrey.
Mabel? Even when he married my mother for the first 8 years, he spent his vacations going back to the farm to make hay. It was the stuff that he loved. He loved working with the animals, and that's quite common with these home children. And I often wonder if the animal was the object of affection, where in some cases they never received affection back. But thankfully, Dad he had gotten a good home.
One day, not long after he arrived in Canada, Fred was put in charge of the children while the parents went to town. When the farmhouse caught fire, Fred managed to get the children out safely. Then he noticed the youngest girl was missing. He raced back into the burning building to pull out 4-year-old Thelma. She's maintained a special place in her heart for him ever since. The bond was also strong between Fred and his Canadian mother, made evident by her response to an offer on her deathbed for one last shopping trip to Boston.
Her reply was that she was going to take Freddie back to England. If she had one more trip in her, the trip was going to be to England with Freddie. If you ask my father, was it a good thing or a bad thing to come to Canada, he would never look back. It was always a good thing to come to Canada.
Despite the difficulties she encountered, Gwenny embraced the Gaelic culture that dominated the small Cape Breton community that became her home. Although the words were never spoken, she bonded deeply with the woman she called Aunt Mary. Her sense of loyalty and responsibility didn't end when the placement came to an end.
They were going to put her in the old people's home. And I said, no way. After Lockie and I got married, we got an apartment in Sydney and we took the old lady with us. And she was here with me for 6 years. She was on bed for 6 years, that she never came off it until they took her to bury her.
Sometimes even the most unhappy of situations had a decent ending, like that of Charles Goddard, who eventually left the farm where he was beaten and went on to a new placement.
So I said to him one day, Charles, how did you make out on the other one? And he paused and he said, all right. He said, they gave me a place to sleep. They gave me enough food to eat. And they didn't beat me. He had suffered in his life, but he is an example of the fact that even in this dark chapter of Canadian history, there were still some small victories.
I was whistling one day, and I was whistling this bluebird song. The old fellow said, stuck his head out the window, said, for heaven's sake, Arthur, can't you whistle something else? I was whistling away. It's funny too now. The old fellow, he joined in and said, you know, that's a nice song, that bluebird song. I was lucky. I was one of the lucky ones. That's about all I know.
In the child migration process, children were separated from country and culture. Relationships with family were severed, access to medical histories, legal records, and birth certificates denied. At the time, total separation was deemed best for the children. Despite many obstacles, home children have persevered. It has been estimated that home children and their descendants now make up almost 12% of Canada's population.
The home children and those former child migrants, we can learn a lot from them because these are people that contributed enormously to this country and whose children also continue that tradition.
I realize that these children went through a lot of extreme hardships, but I do know that they've given their descendants a rich heritage. My mother had to come to Canada and endure the hardships that she did, and she didn't quit, and I'm not going to quit.
And that says a lot. I'm so pleased that she feels that way and that I made that impression on her. It made you feel proud to think that we came over with nothing and that we had done well for ourselves, you know.
I think sometimes these children in their hearts say, if I have the chance to do something good with my life, I'll do it. And if it's to get married and have a family, they do it.
God has been very good to me. He's given me a wonderful life there, you know. I raised a nice family. There's 79 great-grandchildren on there. Then since that, there's 7 or 8 born there. Now my great-grandchildren's having the babies. I'm telling you, there's nothing but babies and babies all the time.
At age 79, Susan hired a researcher and returned to England to uncover the truth about the people and the place she had left behind.
We went to London. He found out my mother died and how old I was. And he found out that I had a sister. He said, "You have a sister?" I said, "Don't tell me." I said, "What do you say to a sister you never seen in your life?"
Dear Mr. Jackson, I have not had a letter from my mother in 2 years. Would you please find out where they live? Give my address to the boys and girls, Mr. Jackson. Yours, Molly Brown.
Although Susan Chappett's search for her sister has spanned 20 years, she has never given up hope.
I'm 94. She's 96 now. So I don't know if she's still living. Then I got Mr. Lorente there. He's on the lookout for them there. I hope he finds her.
David Lorente and his wife Kay founded Home Children Canada in 1991. Lorente, whose own father was a child migrant, is committed to helping home children and their descendants uncover their past.
We're in our 13th year. 2 years ago, I answered 4,418 letters. When I asked those people what they wanted, they told us they wanted the records, their personal records. They didn't want birth, marriage, and death certificates. You can get those, for family, so on. What they really wanted was their personal files that told why the family had fallen on bad times, why they were put in the home, why they were sent to Canada, and so on. It took me 4 years to find my father's name on the ship list because they were unindexed. And I can do in 40 seconds today what it took me 4 years to do.
The National Archives has in a partnership with the British Isles Family History Society of Greater Ottawa, and the volunteers with that society are locating all the names of home children from the passenger list and putting the data into an index, which we have on our website at the Home Children Database. And it's an ongoing project to add more and more names. Right now, it's our major source for searching. It's our starting point.
Well, actually, I started my search into my father's home child background in '63. I wrote to all the agencies. And as a result of writing and asking, do you have records and do you have my father's? What records do you have? I got answers from most of them. And there are people who don't believe that we should be working with the former sending agencies. But that's what we've done. We've worked with the former sending agencies, and we found that they have been very, very cooperative.
Lorente is donating his collection to the National Archives of Canada. Although the Canadian government, through the archives, is compiling information on home children, some feel there is more that can be done.
To know who you are and to know what you are is that fundamental human right. And if the government of Canada has the highest respect for themselves, for their stand on human rights, and they're always quick to voice it, what are they doing about the home children? And the answer is generally, and then the odd plaque, nothing.
In Prince Edward Island, the Canadian Centre for Home Children is attempting to help descendants find living relatives both in Canada and the United Kingdom. John Willoughby, its founder, believes Canadian and British authorities are reluctant to take responsibility.
I was told by the Government of Canada that there was no program to help home children. And I have heard senior representatives of the Department of Heritage in meetings say if they want to find their families, they should pay for it themselves.
I think we've been so consumed with moving the marketplace that we have left behind the social aspects of it. It's out of balance.
This is a picture of my grandfather before he left England in March 1901.
Janet Andregg's grandfather, George Frederick Owen Climson, was admitted to Barnardo's baby castle as an infant and at age 10 was sent to Canada. George was immediately put to work on an Ontario farm where he had a difficult life.
When I got the parcel, first thing I did was rip it open and start reading it, and then I called my sister in Halifax. The thought was that when we got these photographs, they could be anybody. But when we got the photographs, they weren't. You could tell it was him. I've been searching for information on my grandfather's side of the family for about 14 years. It's only been the last 3 years that I've gotten any information. That's the biggest regret, that we didn't get this information when he was still alive, because he always searched for his family.
The biggest concern, I think, is for the second generation descendants. They need answers too. They're looking for information. They're trying to make the connections and establish the contacts with the family. And whatever we can do to make that happen, we should move heaven and earth to do so.
Dorothy Wiggins' son-in-law, daughter and son-in-law are coming to Canada to see if they could meet some of the Clemsons.
The British government has all the information at their hands. If they want to find a living relative, they have the best advantage of doing so. They also, in my opinion, have the biggest responsibility to do so, but they continually try to push it off on the sending agencies. And in my opinion, that's wrong.
This part of history has to be told. They went through too much to be ignored, and it's just not fair. And I'm not going to let that happen.
Many children still come to Canada from other countries, and they arrive alone. They may have fallen into the hands of traffickers. They may be used for sexual exploitation and child labor. Basic human rights were not the consideration for the home children, but they need to be now for children, for all children.
In September of 2002, the first ever Festival of the Home Children was held in Cavendish, Prince Edward Island. The event brought together descendants of home children from across Canada and provided an opportunity for healing.
Think of all of a sudden one side of the family, there's just nothing, you know, and that you need to be able to fill in the blanks and write the names on the family tree.
She didn't talk about it, and it was only in later years that I ever found out that she was a home child.
It makes you wonder on the other side, like in Britain and that too, if they're in the same position, you know, the feeling the loss.
Well, I think sometimes that problems shared are problems diminished. There you are, Betty.
Okay, thank you
very much. Appreciate that. Hi there. Their anxieties are eased when they talk to other people, and they see that other people who live normal and happy lives also know what it was to have had a parent who had gone through this.
Mom missed so much too, and you think she had a tough life at times, and you sort of think, well, hell's bells, if her brother had been around, you know, the family, the support, all that kind of stuff. I guess angry with that whole system, this misguided project they had. And everybody says, you know, that they had good intentions, but I don't think that was the case in all cases, at least not the way they implemented it anyway.
But the underlying motive, the driving force behind child emigration was economic.
This is perhaps one of the greatest human interest stories in Canadian history, and it is a story that needs to be told. It is also one of those stories from which we can learn the past.
It's like a family tree with one side, no branches. You know, I know some of my ancestors on my father's side, but that's one blank side. My mother, and that's it.
It's an elemental, fundamental urge in people to find out who their mother and father were and where they came from and why they came from there. And I think the older you get, the stronger the urge is, because you don't want to go to your grave without knowing.
My mother, I don't think, ever really could show us love. I couldn't approach her and give her a hug, yet my children could. I have difficulty probably showing love with my children. My wife, I'm not affectionate to. My mother wasn't affectionate to me. And I just want to find out, where did this start? I can't feel that I've accomplished anything until I get to the bottom. And I hope to live long enough to do that.
By the time it ended in 1939, the British Child Migration Program was responsible for the immigration of 100,000 children to Canada. Most eventually went on to lead successful lives. Despite the justification that can be made for its existence, the program left in its path a legacy of loss. Most children experienced the loss of family and the loss of identity. But perhaps saddest of all was the loss of childhood. Home children rarely had the chance just to be children.